2 weeks ago, 80 people crowded into a comedy club in Midtown, but not to hear a comedy show. We were all there to listen to a psychology professor give a lecture on consciousness. Daniel Martin Reinerson is a professor of psychology at Montclair State University. He specializes in cognitive science and psychophysics research, and his extensive research includes EEG brainwave studies, behavioral studies, neuroanatomological studies, and investigations into various psychophysical phenomena. He has been involved with institutions such as the BCC STEM, the Kessler Foundation, and the Rutgers Center for Behavioral and Molecular Neuroscience. With over 15 years of experience in spiritual practices and alternative therapies, including certifications in yogic therapy, polarity therapy, and neuromuscular reprogramming, Professor Reinerson brings a uniquely holistic perspective to his psychology work, which is why he was the perfect speaker for his lecture titled Consciousness, Physical Reality, and the Brain. And in today's podcast episode, we will dive even deeper into this topic of consciousness. So, without further ado, let's hop right on in. I'm Felecia. That's Ty. We're the co-founders of Lectures on Tap. Yeah. Welcome to the after show. Daniel, thanks for joining us.
Welcome. Of course, it's a pleasure to be here. Very proud to be in this space with y'all. Loved the lecture we did. Had a great time.
Yes.
It's always a great time. Like your lectures, obviously you've done multiple with us, like curate and create like a particular vibe that no other lecture night has.
It's true.
And in regards to this lecture though, for all those that weren't in attendance, in your own words, how would you define consciousness?
Yeah, so we'll go right back in, I guess. Yeah, so I mean, it's a very big question. This is a question that's been addressed through millennia, really, from everybody from philosophers to spiritual people to scientists. And even in terms of the science, it's so broad in the sense of the biologist, the chemist, the neuroscientist, the psychologist, even people involved in AI. Yeah. And artificial neural networks are trying to answer that question and bring about that question. But the interesting part is I think a lot of times when people start to define consciousness in general, they start to talk a lot about the mind and mental faculties and mental practices. And I think a lot of times, very famous saying is that humans love to experiment with their consciousness, right? In terms of even things just like caffeine and nicotine and alcohol and all of these things that are just common practice. The curious part is that changes your experience. However, experience itself isn't really necessarily what consciousness is. Consciousness is like kind of the foundational layer. To me, consciousness is kind of like the capacity to have experience, right? It's the ability to have it. You know what I mean? We think about consciousness, you're like, oh, I have a consciousness, right? I have conscious experience, right? So the interesting thing is that experience in and of itself a lot of times indicates or is indicative of how people define consciousness, but it's the capacity to have those things.
Do you think it's like self-awareness? Would that be defined as the capacity to have? I guess perhaps not.
This is the interesting part too, is like with philosophy, a lot of people really talk about defining your terms, right? So like what's the difference between kind of awareness versus consciousness? I tend to kind of use them simultaneously. I do believe they're similar things. But there can be degrees of awareness and also what you're aware of, or, to some degree what you're conscious of. And the interesting part for me, taking a kind of philosophical Alan Watts approach, right, is to say if you're conscious, right, you're conscious of something.
Right.
Right. So here's the curious part. If there's nothing there, can you be conscious? If there's nothing to be conscious of,
right. Can you be conscious?
Can you have consciousness?
Yeah, exactly. Even if like I like close my eyes and imagine like something that's pitch black or something like that, even that is something.
Right.
So, even that is something. And therefore, I have not escaped, the challenge that you just presented.
Yeah.
Exactly.
No, it's very interesting too, because I mean, how modern science approaches it is it's always this kind of reductionist view, right? So when we think about when a scientist approaches the idea of consciousness, they say, okay, well, where is it happening, right? Because they're obsessed with mechanism and causal chains. It's like, okay, well, if consciousness is here, like we can trace it to the brain. And interestingly enough, they're still kind of chasing their own tail in the sense that they're looking at variations of experience. You know, when you put someone in an EEG or an fMRI or something like that, you start looking at their brain waves or where blood flow is going in the brain, you're still altering the way that you're looking at what the person is experiencing and the mechanisms behind that experience. If you give someone a math problem or a word problem or an image or try to induce an emotion, right, you'll see what parts of the brain light up in those instances, right? But again, you're still talking about mental faculty.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? So at the end of the day, it's one of these very, very, very elusive kind of questions when it comes to science, because we are always like, well, where does it come from? Right? What does it originate? And, one of the things we touched on in that lecture was like the theory of emergence. And we went really deep. I went a lot into the brain stuff. We haven't touched on that yet. But the funny part is like, again, just really, I guess we're opening this with a very philosophical kind of counterpart. But there was this famous philosopher, Thomas Nagel, who talks about, and this was about the 70s, I think mid 70s, where we started to develop EEG and get the technology for these sorts of things to see into the brain. And, he was like, well, what does it feel like to be a bat? Right. And they were like, oh, okay, well, it has these sorts of processes in its brain and it can map the environment with sound. So it creates an auditory signal, picks that up in its ears, goes to its auditory cortex. It maps it, right? It maps the spatial environment with auditory information, does this, right? And then at the end of the day, he goes, okay, but what does that tell me about what it feels like
Exactly.
to be a bat? It's like, yeah, you just told me a bunch of stuff about like, the chain of maybe electrical information in neurons and all sorts of things. And it's a causal explanation. But however,
Yeah.
where do we get to that? It's one of those things because consciousness is so fundamental. Again, you have that experience.
Yeah.
And trying to explain consciousness at the point of being a conscious being, is really funny because it's like we're conscious beings trying to explain our own device,
And we have like no idea what we're talking about. That's like the interesting thing is like we are conscious. Like I feel like pretty much everyone agrees on that because it's something kind of intuitive, I think, that it's like, how could you deny your own consciousness, right? So I think everyone pretty much universally agrees that they are conscious, but like no one can truly define what it is.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about, again, the idea of consciousness being fundamental, there are certain, scientists, philosophers, David Chalmers being one of them, who talks about consciousness actually being one of the fundamental forces of physics. That there's
Wow.
like, electromagnetism, gravity, strong nuclear force, weak nuclear force, and consciousness.
Wow.
Right.
What?
So this is a
Wow.
crazy idea. Well, they also again, we're approaching this idea from the idea of material science, right? So everything in material science needs causality, it needs a root, right? And it's like, why do we have gravity? Well, the Higgs boson, right? There's a particle. It always has to be traced to a thing,
Right.
right? And there's very much like a thingness
Yeah.
in the way that we, study science. But then, if you look at material science, the biggest problem right now with like the dark energy thing, the dark energy, dark matter,
Right.
the universe, as far as they can measure, the galaxy, the Milky Way, should be flying apart because of how fast it's moving. The centripetal force, it should just fly. These stars should just fly out into space, but for some reason they're being held in place and moved at a speed
Right.
that is way too fast for them to actually be. So there must be more mass
Yeah.
to create the gravity to hold it together.
Right.
So and that's like, so the material, I think it was like 30% of what was actual visible in terms of the galaxy. Maybe somebody might Google me and correct me,
I
but
think you're right.
yeah.
But when I hear that like consciousness is like a foundational aspect along with like gravity and all of the others, I'm like, now we're kind of getting into the realm of like God, right? Which I always think is really interesting because my perspective of like, what is this concept of a God is kind of like whenever we reach the edge and we start the edge of the known and we start venturing into the world of like the unknown, the things that are still mysteries to this day, where it's like, oh, it's God, it's still a mystery. But that's what I hear is like this idea that there must be some sort of consciousness holding it all together in some way.
We don't know what's holding it together. That's the thing. And a materialist science will probably say that there's some sort of, also it could just be, matter that's not emitting light, potentially. It could be gas clouds. But even then, when you take those things into account, there's still the fact that galaxies are flying apart faster than the speed of light. which according to material science is impossible, right? So the expansion of the universe also, supersedes these physical material limits, right? So the curious part is like, if consciousness is a fundamental, and I swear we're going to talk about like neuroscience and shit in a minute, because I'm sure people are like, why are we talking about all this philosophical stuff? But again, it's one of these problems that's just approached from every angle, and
Mhm.
it's not something you can really surmise in like 30 minutes or an hour. But yeah, it's like one of those things where like, what keeps this material reality together and in place? Because according to material science, it's impossible, you
Exactly.
know? So it's really curious, I mean, what taps us into it. And also, I think one of the big things I was trying to define too when we started the lecture, was where does it exist? Because it's in terms of consciousness, it's a multidimensional facet. And I was painting the argument of like, well, is it biological?
Right.
Is it chemical? Or is it, physical, or is it, spiritual? Maybe if you go that route. But the curious part is like, if you take out certain chemicals, one of the ones I was talking about during the lecture was acetylcholine, right?
Hmm.
If you take that out of the nervous system, the person ceases to really be awake. And the wakefulness, right, of conscious experience is what we'd attribute. If someone's in a coma, we say they're unconscious. I mean,
Right.
they're unconscious, but they're still potentially aware, they're still conscious, they're still living, breathing, and you might say maybe they exist in a dream space, maybe their brain, and maybe they're still conscious, they're still
Right.
alive, right? But you know, the capacity to experience, to exchange information is a lot of the ways that we, even as scientists and animals, we judge their um, ability of being conscious off certain behavioral tasks, which is again a really weird kind of paradigm to say like, oh, okay, there's the mirror test, if you guys have
Yeah.
heard, right? So
Mhm.
for those who don't know, right, they put like a mark on a mirror. They did a dolphin recently passed the mirror test. They put a little smear on him, and he went to the mirror and he looked at himself and
Is
he
that like the
recognized
dolphin
himself.
dance?
Yeah, that was,
Because
well,
that's
these are the
like,
fins,
yeah, I see, I see. Okay, all
You're
right.
pivoting around, But they like hit it on his side. So he looked at the side, he looked at the mirror. But I would argue
Okay.
that a mirror is a technology.
Hmm.
Hmm.
And they just don't understand. Maybe they just don't understand the technology. They see it and they see another animal. I mean, I'm sure they've seen their reflection in water before. When an animal goes to drink water and then they see,
Yeah.
themselves, they don't freak out,
Yeah.
Yeah.
right? But a bear sees a mirror in the woods. I don't know if you've seen a video of that. They immediately freak out because
Exactly.
they don't understand. But
Yeah.
so for them to, the precursor of them to recognize themselves
Right.
in the mirror and then know that that's them and then see the dot on themselves, they'd have to understand what a mirror is to begin with.
Right.
So we run into our own limitations often in science by the fact that we're biased by the methods we use, and this is
Mm.
just such a difficult, thing to kind of address in that sense.
Yeah.
But
Because for me, I have always felt like plants were conscious,
Mm.
but like it's just an intuitive feeling.
right.
I
Yeah,
feel like they're
exactly.
conscious. When you hug
Right.
them, you feel something.
The thing is,
Well, I was gonna say the only thing you know is conscious is you, right?
yeah, that would be the Descartes approach.
Mm.
Right.
Descartes says he was the I think therefore I am guy,
Exactly.
right? But he was like saying that, and the only thing he could actually confirm
Exactly.
was his own consciousness. Everything
Right.
could be a
Yes.
projection of
Exactly. Because I don't know whether you two are conscious. I am assuming
Yeah.
and
Right.
acting like you guys are.
right.
So
That's one of my
I'm watching you.
favorite
Yeah.
philosophical concepts to think about. Solipsism is the name,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
Where it's like the only thing that is known to exist is yourself, really.
Yeah.
So this idea that like you could totally be a simulation,
Right.
you could be a hologram, you could be a robot, and like sure, we can like
Like I never
cut you open. Yeah, we
Yeah,
can cut you open, but that
exactly.
actually won't really prove anything.
It won't.
Why?
It
Right.
won't. Yeah.
It won't, because of this tension that you're talking about right now. This
Right.
tension between like nothing seems to be able to prove
Yeah.
or disprove
Mhm.
consciousness.
Right.
I think that becomes an issue too, because I think with a lot of like early neuroscience stuff, everything was localized, right? So language is like here, right? Vision is processed here, right?
Mhm.
So everything was localized in the brain. It's like, this is where it is,
Mhm.
right? And that for material science was really pleasing because it's like, oh, cool, like language is coming from this spot,
Right.
and this spot makes language, and this does this. And again, a material mechanism is always what we're looking for. But trying to define consciousness is like, well, where is it? Because if you look at other traditions, some believe that the center of the being is in the heart,
Right.
right? Samurais, they would hit the point in their belly because they thought that they originated
There.
in
Mm,
Korean yoga, Dan yoga. Also, the Dantian point is also in the stomach.
mm,
They believe that is the place of life. That is the place that brings, your being into existence. I mean, really looking at, I think, thinking that consciousness exists, or that I would argue maybe that the stream of consciousness comes from the brain, in the sense of we
Hmm.
control our stream of conscious experience through the associations and the neural networks that are existent, right? So you have a smell, right? And you're like, oh, that smells like the perfume that my grandmother had, right? My grandmother used to bake these really good cookies, and now all of a sudden you're going to the store and you're trying to, like, you know what I mean? You're trying to find cookie dough, and you're like, right? Because of this stream of association, now it gives rise to this experience, which is a product of the neural network, the associations that are implicit in your brain,
Right.
right? However, that's controlling the mechanism of how we behave and think and all those sorts of things and how we lead our conscious lives. But again, it doesn't say much to the foundation of the consciousness in and of itself. So it becomes
Exactly.
very interesting,
Yeah,
yeah.
a hundred
you know.
percent.
And then I also wanted to get your perspective on, apparently there are literal levels to consciousness as well, right? Like we have consciousness, but then we have unconsciousness, then we
hmm
have the subconscious.
hmm
And how would you experience, or how would you talk about like these differences, right? Because like a classic example is, I'm sure, I mean, we're in New York, but I know you know how to drive, and you're not really from here.
I'm from Jersey.
You're from
Yeah,
Jersey, so
yeah.
you
My,
drive.
my my parents are from New York. Yeah.
Okay, we all drive. We all know what
Yes.
that's like. We
Yeah.
all have
Yes.
been riding or driving in a car, long distance, and you get to your destination and you're like, I barely remember the ride.
Mhm.
And that is typically thought of as like, no, that was like a subconscious experience, not an unconscious, but obviously you're still conscious. So how would you kind of define like the differences between conscious, unconscious, subconscious,
Yeah,
and if there are any
there's a
other
lot. There's a lot
consciousnesses?
to be said there. And also, like, I mean, an example of like driving a car and kind of losing that, I would argue that that's your attention,
Mm,
right? You're not necessarily paying attention, and then the faculty is that when you pay attention specifically to something, your brain is encoding that information, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're not paying attention to the ride, or imagine you're driving and something is really happening on the road and you didn't hear what your friend said in the passenger seat,
mm,
right? You because you weren't paying attention to it. So your brain doesn't encode it. And literally we can follow these trains. There's something called a dichotic listening experiment, right? Where they're literally played two different streams of information, like two people uttering a sentence, right? In different ones in each ear, right?
mm.
And they'll say, pay attention to the right one. And the person will be able to immediately regurgitate the sentence that was said in their ear, right? And they say, okay, what happened in the left one? They're like, oh, I don't know. They have zero recollection.
Exactly.
And this is the thing where it's like, because you're not attending to it, your brain is not encoding that information, right? So naturally with that sort of example, you know, I think maybe conscious, and this is also what's so difficult is because sometimes the definitions in everyday language get really mixed up. Like, is
Yeah.
consciousness awareness? Is it attention? Is it, all sorts of different faculties. So I think in that sense, attention is one aspect, right? But could you be, let's say, you're aware of things, or things can be in your sphere of awareness, and also like at a moment's notice, like if someone says your name at the other side of the room, you're not paying attention to it, you're not attending to it, but it catches your attention eventually.
Exactly.
Um, but I'm kind of, in terms of your question, like with these layers, right? I mean, again, the way that we use these terms in everyday language get really complicated, and everyone's trying to define consciousness, right? So different people approach it from different angles. And if you look at it from like, the an anesthesiologist, right, who's like giving, things for people to do surgery, you're knocking them unconscious, right?
Right.
That would be
Right.
the distinction, that you're unconscious and you're conscious, right? But I corrected myself before when I was talking about somebody in a coma, like that they're not conscious. But wait, they are conscious, right? They might be having a conscious experience, but they're not responsive, right? So this is the curious part. And then, you go as far back to Freud, who talked about what we now say subconscious
Mhm.
processes, right? Which is just the fact that you have motivators and drivers in your everyday life that you're not necessarily aware of,
Mhm.
Right.
right? It's escaping your awareness because it's just like consciousness is this base layer for you to have experience. He would argue that, obviously we're conscious, but there is first of all, primal instinct, right? There are imprinted like conditions and conditioning, right? That is given to you at almost at birth. This is why Freudian psychology loves to talk about childhood all day, because
Mhm.
when you're like,
Mm,
maybe you react a certain way to someone, to your friend, and right, and they spoke to you in a certain way that reminded you of like your mother, or
exactly.
something from that instance. And those initial imprints, right, a lot of times can be subconscious, right? You're reacting to someone in a positive light because unconsciously or subconsciously they're familiar to you, they feel familiar, right? This is why they always talk about people who get into relationships, right, with people who are similar to their parent figure or something like that, because
Exactly.
there's these unconscious drivers. You feel familiar and I don't know why, right? And that kind of deja vu, like, ooh, this is
Exactly.
intriguing, but I don't, you know what I mean? That kind of thing happens all the time,
Yeah.
so it's interesting for sure.
Do you agree with Freudian's like way of I guess categorizing the mind in terms of conscious, subconscious, then unconscious?
Yeah, also he has an aspect of preconscious too, which is
Exactly.
interesting in the
Yes.
middle. Which is things that are like not necessarily accessible, or well, they are accessible, but they're not in your conscious mind at the moment, right? So the things that your conscious mind has access to, sometimes they might need like an activator, right? So like for example, maybe you see a friend you haven't seen in like super long, right? And you start talking, you're hanging out, and all of a sudden like, oh my God, remember when we did that, right? And all these things start coming up, right? That's preconscious because it's in your brain, kind of stored in memory, right? And then it can bubble up to the surface. And sometimes even
Exactly.
unconscious things can bubble up to the surface. But in terms of whether I agree, I think that that's science that's 100 years old. You know
Exactly.
what I mean? So we've
Yeah.
built a lot on top of that, especially now understanding the mechanisms of like the hippocampus and how it grows new neurons.
Right.
Parts of even, as we're talking about altering consciousness, psilocybin, something that gives a radical alteration of consciousness, or I would say alteration of your experience, right? Because, we
Exactly.
clarify that, but that leads to the growth of new neurons, so all sorts of things. And I think that it's a simplification, right? Even his division of saying like that you're the ego mediating the id and the superego, right? You're this idea of like the animal self and the civilized self.
Right.
And it makes sense because it gives you interaction, and then it makes the mind, which is just a singular word. It doesn't explain anything. It's just, oh, that's your mind doing that, right? It's like, well, no, that's the more primal side of myself versus the civilized, what I should do and what my rule structures are and my role that I play that influences how my personality functions and the pattern of association that my brain follows.
Yeah.
And we've built a lot of, I think, a scaffolding over top of what he's done. But he was one of the first, I guess, to analytically, I mean, he was really the founder of the psychoanalytic method of like, hey, sit on this couch. I'm
Yeah.
going to listen to you talk, and then we're going to figure out, you know,
Yeah.
by how you frame situations, how you frame what you're talking about, what is under the surface, right? In that sense.
Yeah. Freud's had a lot of weird theories as well.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
A lot of geniuses are like that.
Yeah.
Like just a lot of like super smart people, they're also very weird,
Yeah.
And you usually learn about them like after they die.
Exactly.
It all
the,
starts
the
coming
can
to
the can of worms
surface.
just comes
Yeah,
out. You know what
exactly.
I mean? Yeah, that's
Exactly.
very interesting.
No, I do. Going back to like how you started this, actually, it's so true. And I feel like we don't really think about it enough of like how prevalent conscious really is to like our everyday life now. Like, I feel like it's like a common conversation starter. I mean, it's kind of, you're right. Like everyone's kind of talking about it. And I remember looking up that like the first mention of like this concept of consciousness, it's only a couple hundred years old. I think it was like in the 17th century or the 16th century. That was like the first ever like documented instance of someone using consciousness in a modern way. But yeah, especially with AI nowadays, I feel like we hear about that all the time. And it is kind of interesting. Like we have not figured out what makes someone conscious, and yet we're actively developing beings, and we all know that like that is the scariest thing to happen, is for these beings that we're creating, or well, they're not beings, but for these items that we're creating to become beings that then have consciousness,
Right,
but we
right.
we wouldn't even know.
Yeah, that's what I
Yeah.
was gonna ask.
Yeah.
One, like the first question I had was, are we gonna be able to create, conscious AI beings or items. But then I thought, like, well, we would have to first, how are we going to realize that? How
This
are we
is,
going to
yeah,
learn that if we can't answer that question for
for
ourselves?
ourselves.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's
it's
a
a
You
huge
know,
conundrum.
like,
problem,
It's
is
how
a
it
are we
not?
going to
conundrum.
say, that
Yeah,
ChatGPT right now is not
Yeah,
yeah.
aware?
exactly. And these AIs, if they are smart and malicious, then they can just claim consciousness because they know
Right.
that's kind of
Yeah.
like our kink as humans,
So I guess that's one thing. ChatGPT is, from my understanding, will not do anything unless prompted to. So I'm
Right.
pretty sure that's like one like sign
Hmm.
is unprompted
Mm,
action.
Yeah. I mean, the interesting part is to say something's being malicious. Malicious intent, right? I want to emphasize the word intent there. And to have intention means that you have a motive or something like that.
Right.
As, even to pivot back to like the Freud idea, it's like you have unconscious motivations, you have primal instincts because you're a being that evolved over evolution or evolved to exist in a space such as reality where you had to fight tigers and, run out of things. And those things gave us the capacity. Our eyesight got better to pick blueberries, our color, the people who evolved color perception could figure that out faster. The people who had better senses of smell, better faculties to use tools. You know what I mean? But the thing is something like, so we had the intent. Our prime motivation is survival, right? So we built the faculty of what we are out of those necessities. But then we became, maybe not became, but we're social beings as well, and that allowed us to build community, and to further survival by creating the division of labor, which we now even see in industrialized civilization that, you're a writer and you're a plumber and you're this and everyone kind of has their own little facets of what they do. Um, but with something like ChatGPT, right? It being conscious, again, the conundrum that like, if we can't define consciousness for ourselves, how can we say that this thing is conscious, right?
Right.
Um, but to me, it's a language model.
Right.
If you build a robot and you teach it how to speak and you give it access to the internet, first of all,
mhm.
it has a repository to answer your question, just like Google. I mean, if you type into Google, why is what's up with orange cats, right? And it answers you, and you're like, oh wow, that's why, because they have like more something or whatever. You know what I mean? More ferocity, and it's like, oh my god, how did Google know that?
Right.
Google must be conscious. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
It's like it's literally just this feedback of a language model that's been made more and more sophisticated to the point where this is the perfect example of the Turing test, right? Which is literally just this idea of like, if you had, I mean, ChatGPT is the Turing test, Google that
Exactly.
if you want to read about it. But like, it's literally like you put information out. And I think with that, it's like someone's in there, right? And it's like Chinese, but they could like translate it and they knew the responses, but and they could just give the answer back, right? In whatever language it might be. If you just knew the rules of grammar and you knew the information, you could just write it back and give it back. Does that mean that person understands Chinese or that language or whatever?
Mm,
It's like, no, not necessarily.
like
They're just,
mapping.
it's an if-then statement, which is what a
Exactly.
computer is,
Right.
But here's the thing. Are we not that as humans, right? Like,
Mhm,
are we not also language models in like various
mhm,
ways? Like whether it's verbal language, body language, like aren't we all just mapping to things that we have been programmed with,
mhm.
you know?
Yeah, I mean, if you talk about conditioning, you can think about that as like we're stimulus response machines, right? Which is behaviorism and all that sort of stuff. What they
Exactly.
want you to think. But I would also argue, there's a couple points to touch on here, but um, maybe addressing that immediately. Um, I'm like, my brain is literally frying right now because I'm trying to go back and there's so many things to comment on in that statement. But can you reframe it?
Yeah,
Reframe that real
yeah.
quick.
Well, that's the thing. That's what I've always thought is like, you know, it's easy to shit on these machines and be like,
Hmm.
they can't be conscious. It's just,
Hmm.
it's just machines. It's
Yeah.
just wires connected to other wires,
Hmm.
connected to systems that are ultimately connected to databases.
Right.
Code.
Yeah, but are we not that as human beings? Are
Yeah.
we not beings that come out completely fresh and then we are taught language, we are taught body language, we are taught pretty much everything? Aren't we programmed? And therefore, aren't we just, isn't everything that I say just like a mapping of something that I've learned?
Yeah.
Like to your point about like different
Right.
languages, like there are other languages that have concepts that I don't even know about as a human or as an American. And so those are like that I don't know about as an American. And so those concepts I don't even have access to. It's almost in the same way as like, you know, a chat GPT might not have access to the ability to, you know, think for itself or answer its own question. It's like, what really is the difference? Because we say we're not machines because we're like biological beings, but like, isn't our body kind of a machine as well? I mean, you know?
I mean, we exist on that scaffolding, and I think the more that we're able to emulate and get closer and closer to the emulation, like, can ChatGPT see, right? Like that's another thing that they would have to code for and create. And that's why the question of like, are you a robot? It's always like, pick the bicycle in the picture, you know what I mean?
Exactly.
But it's a radical computational process to be able to pull out where's the bike and where do these lines go? And if it's behind a fence, right? All of these obscuring things that are there. So, you know, we could argue at this point, right, that, well, we have more access to reality than ChatGPT does. We have vision, we have the ability to hear, right, which Alexa and all these other things and Siri have the ability to hear, right?
Yeah.
But then can they taste, right? Or then can they feel, right? These are other sensory experiences, and not even to talk about the emotion of things. Can it experience emotion? Because emotion is an alteration of biochemical processes in the body, right? So can going back, it's like, can a ChatGPT know what acetylcholine feels like? Can it know what adrenaline feels like, or oxytocin? It's like those are chemical alterations which are not necessarily the five senses, but they're not abstractions, but they're embodiments, literally embodied, right? So it's like, and then we can again make the argument as science advances, maybe it'll feel even better. It'll feel even better. You have higher sensitivity of like gauging textures, right? It could eventually, you could put something in an orifice and it could taste it. It could actually pick out the chemicals and stuff better than you can, right? So the initial argument of like, okay, maybe we can just make them emulate sensory experience, right? But then the part becomes, and this is where I was starting to go at the end of the lecture, talking about quantum computing, talking about traditional computers and how they try to emulate, again, ChatGPT being a language model built off binary systems, right? Which are this way of representing information in a logical way, right? But it's using electrical pulses, right, to do so. And it's representing that information, not really taking that information at face value, but creating and transmuting that information into a binary code, which goes through a program, and does all sorts of things like this, right? So it's represented information that then gets interpreted, right? But with the embodiment that we have raw data, very, very raw data, which the body is the mechanism for transmuting. And there's even people, Stuart Hameroff is a really interesting neuroscientist who talks about quantum spins in the atoms, the carbon atoms, basically in the skeleton of a neuron, that these things are receptive to quantum fluctuations. And apparently, that this stream of consciousness that we have, right, that we think, oh, perfume, grandma, cookies, go to the store, right? That's a conscious stream. But also, like, what of a thought that comes out of nowhere? Where did that come from? And what's to be said about if this is a biocomputer, allegedly by analogy, what's to be said about entanglement as a physical principle, right? Because if entanglement is something which is like the coordination of spin symmetries of quantum particles, that if two particles are at one point connected and then they come out, which is like, think about water. Water goes in your body and out your body over eons. Like there could be a water molecule in your body that was in George Washington, you know what I mean? And like, what does that have to do?
I do not like that thought.
Right? But like, could that to some degree connect you to his consciousness?
Whoa.
Interesting.
In terms of quantum spin symmetry and all sorts of things that, because again, if we're organisms that exist in physical, this is why I titled it Physical Reality in the Brain. Because what the brain is doing is it's picking up on it exists and has grown and evolved in physical reality. So it's susceptible to all the laws of physics. And as you start learning into quantum, information theory, entanglement, um, what is that? The double slit experiment, which shows like, the particle wave duality,
Hmm.
that like quantum states are inherently unpredictable. And it just goes out the window when you try to talk about material science. And this is where the point is that our science is getting so advanced that it's like, okay, well, if these are all fundamental principles in terms of entanglement and all these other things, how do they then apply to the brain and how the brain has formed itself and how the brain has made itself? And this is one of the things that I'd argue against like robots and whatever computers becoming conscious is they don't have that embodiment. They didn't arise out of the earth.
Right.
You know what I mean? So they don't have access to those sorts of, I think, fundamental processes that we do as much. Because again, they're representing information through a logical structure, which is
Exactly.
a projection of our consciousness. So maybe the unconscious, right, might be the key to fully becoming aware if you can access that, to some degree. Um,
Wow.
Yeah. I'm still stuck on George Washington, like blew into a
Exactly.
napkin and like
And
that's
entanglement.
right.
I'm
I'm
sorry,
not
yeah.
hip on
This is
I have
that
I've never had
you
that thought
know,
before. No, because
yeah.
that's
This
like,
is why my brain kind of like blew up before I was like, okay, hold on.
It's
We
like,
gotta
Exactly.
right. How do I express this?
Yeah.
No, that is also one of my favorite things to like philosophize about is where do ideas come from?
Mhm.
Because as someone who has like a lot of ideas, like there are
Right.
times where they just pour in. I'm like, where is this coming from?
Yeah.
And it doesn't, I mean, even things like being able to control when they come, like if we could really understand where ideas come from, like imagine all of the things that we just don't have ideas for.
I think you'd get bored.
Hmm.
Like if you knew where everything was coming from, you could see it coming. I get personally, this is funny because if I do this for my day and I know exactly what's going to happen and I planned it all out and it's like, oh, I have to do this test, then I'm going to go here, then I'm going to go to the bank, then I'm going to do this, and I get bored. I'm like, ugh, today's going to suck because I just know everything is going to happen. Like for me
Same.
personally, I love the spontaneous nature of things.
Mm.
And sometimes I feel like if you knew every thought that was going to happen, well, that's not exciting.
Yeah.
But maybe that's
It's
just
almost
me
like, why be
personally.
here?
Yeah, I don't know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're almost at time.
Mhm.
I want to, let's see. I want to hear a little more on, 'cause you have a 12-week program
Correct.
that goes over, I believe, yoga practices in psychology. What is the number one principle within your program that's impacted your life the most?
Impacted my life. That's an interesting point. I would honestly say, I mean, the yogic principles are probably some of the most just fundamental things that have changed my perspective on life in general. Because again, when we think about learning and knowledge, it's very linear and it's very like logical, which again is, as we were just talking about, it's kind of like one facet of the mind. Being more aware, in certain practices, there's one practice that I really love that's just like softening of the gaze, right? Which is like your gaze, as in where you're looking out. You can look at everything simultaneously, like, right? We can make eye contact, but at the same time, we can see everything in the room at the exact same time.
Exactly.
And being less linear with how you process information, you feel into this fabric or this void space where I think is the opening of awareness. And a lot of a lot of this I integrated into. So as much as it is good to understand psychology and psychological faculty, understanding like the self-fulfilling prophecy and like how you can have potential cognitive bias, enhance your emotional intelligence. These are all great things logically, but also without going into that deeper nature of being, you kind of become just more conditioned and also more rule oriented. You're kind of strengthening your ego in a sense if you just try to control your habits in your
Mm,
life. And everyone, is really about optimizing my habits and getting the best and being really efficient and all this stuff. You're
right.
making yourself more like a robot, I would argue,
Mhm.
So I think a lot of the yogic practices, in just terms of mindfulness, meditation, understanding all these things. And that is the great facet of the program. So initially, it starts with a lot of these psychological principles. It moves into some of the yogic principles, dives into some of that, and then ultimately, I go into things like biophysics and heart math and all these kind of fringe sciences that are coming out now. that give more of a fusion as well to the idea of spiritual nature, and what spiritual nature might even be. You know what I mean? As we talk about this idea of embodiment, like feeling and picking up on like quantum spin symmetries, and then quantum coherence is a really big thing too, right? So like, can you enhance quantum coherence in your body through meditative practice, right? And can you feel that? Because, you know, what is sensation, right? As we said before, emotion isn't really any of the five senses. It's kind of less tangible. It's something that globally affects the function of the being,
Mm,
right? And the same thing is, you know, underneath emotion can be like those prime motivators, and then those senses of like consciousness. Is conscious quantum coherence, right? And again, it becomes runs again the same problem. Is it serotonin? Is it the structure of the brain? Is it chemical? Is it biological? Is it you know? But yeah, I think some of these things is allows your intellectual brain to let go of doubt and dive into what's possible. Because
interesting.
you know, I feel like for a lot of people, they stay, even just look at the practice of meditation. They're like, "Oh, you're just sitting there. That's like silly, like whatever.
Right.
That's a religious thing." Right? And it's like, no, like you're resetting your nervous system, right? And you're doing these. So when you put it in this kind of frame, it allows someone to be like, oh, okay, that's cool. And it kind of bypasses the intellectual brain and allows you to let go into the practice. Because one of the biggest things with meditation is people will be like, well, you know, like, what am I doing? And I'm just sitting here and like, or I keep having thoughts and like, I don't know what to do. And it's like, no, do nothing. Intentionally don't do anything. You know, even like, you know, a lot of these guided meditations are like, do this and focus on your breathing and do these things. And these are good because it trains attention. And if you can kind of train attention, that's one faculty, right? But again, like letting go into that deeper experience is a really big thing. So in the program, the 12-week program I have, that you can find at selfperpetual.com, is integrates all of that. Because again, each one of those things, and it's curious too, because just as we're talking about consciousness, like you can define it from this angle, you can define it from this angle and this angle.
Exactly.
Same thing with like life and the being, and really what I say is like the human person, right? Like the first lecture I did with you guys, the concept of self,
Yeah.
right? This was this idea where like I have a person, right? And I cognitively define myself. I define myself through my thoughts, right? Which is a
Exactly.
linguistic thing.
Mhm.
You know, someone says, "Who are you?" And you go, "Well, I live here and I do this
Mhm.
and I you know, this is what I like to do and these are the people I hang out with." But those are very linguistic and on the surface, but sometimes you could say, "Who are you?" But don't answer that with words. You know, answer that in your eyes, right? Answer that with your being, right? Because that's not necessarily a question that can be answered. It's just like with Taoism. You know, Taoism is like this idea that how do you define the Tao? The Tao is like everything, right? And the second you try to define the Tao, you're already limiting what it is,
Hmm.
right? So when you say, who am I? And you start defining these different things, you're already limiting yourself, right? Because you're giving a linear, logical definition, right? When you are much grander than that. And I think that's something that like the yogic practices really key you into, that it's like there's a deeper nature to being, right? And then that's,
Exactly.
you know,
I was a
what.
yogi for like a year. Like I
Mhm.
got really into it
Cool.
and it was awesome. And it totally, I feel like even though now I don't do it um, as much nowadays as, yeah, I barely do it at all now. But one of the things that I'll never forget from like that period of my life is like I was working retail at Crate and Barrel during the holiday season. I had a coworker. I was always talking to her about like how amazing yoga was. One day we had this crazy customer come in, and I was complaining to her about it or something like that. And she goes to me like, "You do yoga, right?" I'm like, "Yeah." She's like, "Okay, well, now is the time to do yoga. Like, don't have yoga be this 15-minute thing that you do in the morning. Like,
Exactly.
okay, cool. You can be like flexible there. Like, can you be flexible here in the real
Mhm.
world? Do
Exactly.
you know how to bend to speak the language of this customer that's right in front of you?
Exactly.
Or adjust yourself to be okay with it
Hell yeah.
and not take it as like a hit to your ego or something like
Mhm.
that." But
Exactly.
yeah, no,
That's how
yeah.
I
Mhm.
try to like navigate the world. Sometimes I'm successful, sometimes I'm not, but it's just can I be mindful not when everything's controlled and I'm in the middle of my apartment and nothing's going to bother me and it's just my thoughts, it's just me against my thoughts, but how mindful can I be in personal interactions, when like my expectations aren't met. Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yeah, that can be a faculty. I a lot of times say like you don't know who somebody is until you see them when they're angry. You know what I mean? Or when something
yes.
doesn't go their way to some extent. But yeah, yoga is definitely it becomes a really strong analogy for life. Because a lot of times too, even when people start practicing yoga, it's like the fact that maybe you can't touch your toes, right? You start doing yoga for 2 weeks, a month, you can touch your toes. You now, in terms of your body, can now do things you didn't think you could do, right? So it alters the way that you
Yeah,
think of possibility. And this is one of the things in psychology where they talk about growth mindset. It's like people a lot of times say they think about they have a fixed mindset where they think that, I am this type of person and I wouldn't get that job and I would never find myself here or, I really like to stay in this kind of thing. And you define those limitations for yourself, right? And you believe them, right? So then when you start to push the envelope with yoga, maybe, hey, after a month you can touch your toes. After 3 months, maybe you could kind of like do a good handstand or something like that. And it starts to push the idea into your brain unconsciously that like you are capable of change. And I think that is a huge
exactly.
thing as well. Not only just the practice of like, and bringing mindfulness, as you said too, is like a really awesome way to bring it off of the mat and just reset your nervous system, man. They have that saying, it's like this straw that broke the camel's back,
Mm.
right? It's like that little thing that happens that just sets you off.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like yoga, meditation, mindfulness is a way of just lightening the load so that when that little straw hits, the straw's nothing, man.
Right.
You know what I mean? It
Exactly.
brings down that level so that everyday other occurrences you can approach from that frame and ultimately, even bring into transmutation and all of those like ancient sciences as well that kind of echo these ideas. So I'm always a big proponent for like that holistic approach because it's like, well, these guys are saying that and these guys are saying this. Like alchemy is like emotional intelligence and like yoga is like,
Exactly.
nervous system work, they're all kind of parallels, but depending on the kind of language you use and the type of, person you're talking to, certain ideas are more accepted, right? Depending on
For
how you
sure.
frame them, but it's a whole big world, man.
Yeah.
The whole big world out there.
Yes. Yes.
Cool. Well, where can people find you?
So yeah, right now you can go to my website, selfperpetual.com. Check out that. All of my my workshops are on there. So I have a 12-week program that's coming up. It actually starts in April 1st. If you guys are seeing it prior to that time in 2025, the year of our Lord,
Yeah.
2025. Whenever you're watching this in the future or wherever
Right.
you may be. But yeah, check out my website over there. Also Self Perpetual on Instagram. You can reach me a little bit more directly. But yeah, I have the access to that program. I'll be publishing everything that I'm doing on through those channels. And people can check that out. Also, my old podcast, which I might revive at some point, was called The Conscious Endeavor. So if people want to
Okay.
maybe dive into that and see me as a
Yeah.
young blood,
Nice.
Yeah.
as a young blood, as
Absolutely.
some
And
people might
we
say.
have you in a few weeks for
Yes.
another lecture,
Yes.
which will
Yes,
be
we
very
do,
cool
which
and
is
interesting.
going to be very exciting.
Yes.
Music and mathematics, right?
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
Exactly.
So the wormhole goes even deeper. We'll start talking about vibration. We'll talk about the Pythagoras
Yep.
tuning standard. I'm going to talk about the way that we break up the octave and frequency and all sorts of crazy things, which is another whole wormhole.
Yes.
But that's going to be a
Exactly.
fun one for
That's
sure.
going to be
Yes.
awesome. If you guys can't tell at home, this is our rabbit hole guide. So we just go deeper and deeper every month that he gives a
Yes.
lecture.
Absolutely. All right, cool. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. I'm Ty. This is Felecia. This is Professor Reinerson. And yeah, we'll see you next time.